Deep in the Colorado wilderness, where the nearest neighbor lives 40 miles away, a 12-year-old boy named Samuel discovers something that will change his life forever. Left behind when his family moved away without him, Samuel stumbles upon the rotting remains of an old homesteader's cabin tucked beneath towering pine trees. The roof has collapsed, the walls are crumbling, and wildlife has claimed it as their own. Most children would see only decay and danger. Samuel sees possibility. With winter approaching and nowhere else to go, he makes a decision that defies all logic. Armed with nothing but a rusty hammer, some bent nails, and the survival skills his grandfather taught him, Samuel begins the impossible task of rebuilding this forgotten structure. Day by day, board by board, he transforms decay into hope. But here's what nobody expected. How did a child accomplish what would challenge grown men? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel had always been different from other children his age, though he never understood why, until the day his family drove away without him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel driveway of his distant cousin's farmhouse when he realized the terrible truth. His parents had left during the night, taking his younger sister but leaving behind only a hastily written note and $27 tucked into his worn backpack. The note, written in his mother's careful cursive, explained that times were too hard, that they couldn't afford to feed everyone, and that Cousin Martha would take good care of him. But Cousin Martha had her own troubles. Her husband had lost his job at the lumber mill, and 3 days after Samuel's parents disappeared, she loaded him into her rusted pickup truck with a bag of stale sandwiches and drove him to the edge of the national forest. "You're a smart boy, Samuel," she had said, her voice thick with guilt and desperation. "Your grandfather taught you things. You'll figure something out." Then she was gone, leaving nothing but dust clouds and the sound of an engine growing fainter in the distance. Standing alone at the forest's edge, Samuel felt the weight of abandonment settle over him like a heavy blanket. But beneath the hurt and confusion, something else stirred. His grandfather's voice, clear as mountain water, echoing from summers past when Samuel would spend weeks at the old man's cabin learning skills that other children his age spent. Playing video games. A man's worth isn't measured by what others give him, Grandfather had always said, his weathered hands guiding Samuel's small fingers as they learned to tie knots, identify edible plants, and read the sky for weather signs. It's measured by what he can do with his own 2 hands when everything else is stripped away. Samuel reached into his backpack and pulled out his grandfather's brass compass, the one treasure his parents hadn't thought valuable enough to take. The needle pointed steadily north, but more than direction. It offered something precious, connection to the man who had believed in him when no one else seemed to. The compass led him deeper into the wilderness than any 12-year-old should venture alone. For 3 days, he survived on wild berries, stream water, and the jerky his grandfather had taught him to make during their last summer together. He built small shelters from pine boughs, started fires with flint and steel, and moved carefully through terrain that would challenge experienced hikers. On the 4th day, following a game trail that wound between massive Douglas firs, Samuel discovered the cabin, or what remained of it. The structure sat in a small clearing where wildflowers had once grown in neat rows, now overgrown with weeds and brambles. The roof had caved in completely, and one wall leaned dangerously inward. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets, their glass long since claimed by weather and time. Most people would have seen only ruin and decay. Samuel saw potential. He approached slowly, the way his grandfather had taught him to approach all unknown situations. Wildlife had indeed claimed the space. Fresh deer droppings littered the floor, and scratch marks on the remaining walls suggested bears had used the structure for shelter. But beneath the debris and neglect, Samuel could see good bones. The foundation stones were solid, mortared with care by someone who understood building for permanence. The main support beams, though weathered, remained straight and strong. Inside the collapsed structure, partially buried under fallen timbers, Samuel discovered a water-stained photograph in a cracked frame. The image showed a family much like his own. A father, mother, and 2 children standing proudly in front of the cabin when it was new. The mother held a baby, while a boy about Samuel's age stood beside his father, both wearing expressions of hope and determination. The photograph spoke to something deep in Samuel's chest. Here was proof that people had built dreams in this place, had believed enough in the future to construct a home with their own hands. The fact that they had ultimately left didn't diminish the courage it had taken to try. As darkness approached on his 4th day alone, Samuel made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of continuing deeper into the wilderness or attempting to find his way back to civilization, he would stay. He would rebuild what had been lost. He would prove to himself and to the memory of his grandfather that a person's worth truly was measured by what they could accomplish with their own hands. That first night, sleeping on pine boughs inside the ruined walls, Samuel listened to the sounds of the wilderness around him. Owls called through the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the stars. But for the first time since his parents had abandoned him, Samuel didn't feel alone. He felt purpose. The photograph of the unknown family sat propped against a stone near his makeshift bed, and by the light of his small fire, Samuel studied their faces. He wondered what had driven them away, what dreams had died in this place. But more importantly, he wondered what new dreams might be born here. His grandfather's compass sat beside the photograph, its brass surface reflecting the firelight. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, he would start building something that would last. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain clearing, painting the ruined cabin in shades of gold and amber. Samuel woke to the sound of chipmunks chattering in the nearby trees and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. His body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in weeks. For the first time since his abandonment, he had a purpose. He stood slowly, brushing pine needles from his clothes, and approached the cabin with fresh eyes. In daylight, the damage looked even more extensive than he had first realized. The entire eastern wall had buckled inward, and what remained of the roof sagged dangerously over the interior space. Debris filled every corner, rotted timbers, rusted metal fixtures, and years of accumulated leaves and animal nests. But Samuel had learned from his grandfather to look beyond surface problems to underlying potential. The foundation was solid fieldstone, laid with the kind of careful craftsmanship that spoke of permanence and pride. The main support posts, hewn from massive pine logs, remained straight and true despite decades of neglect. Someone had built this place to last. Moving carefully around the perimeter, Samuel began cataloging what could be salvaged and what would need complete replacement. He found the remains of a hand-dug well, its wooden cover long since rotted away, but the stone-lined shaft still holding clear water 20 feet down. A root cellar carved into the hillside behind the cabin remained structurally sound. Though filled with debris, it was while clearing rubble from what had once been the main room that Samuel made his most important discovery. Wedged between 2 fallen roof beams, protected by an oilcloth wrapper, lay a leather-bound journal. The cover was water-stained and moldy, but the pages inside remained largely readable. Samuel opened the journal carefully, his heart racing as he read the first entry, written in a careful, masculine hand. May 15th, 1943. Today I broke ground for our new home. Mary says I'm crazy to build so far from town, but after what I've seen in the war, I need the peace that only these mountains can provide. The nightmares are getting worse, and the doctors say the quiet might help. Little Tommy helped me carry stones for the foundation. He's only 8, but he's got the makings of a good worker. Samuel's hands trembled as he turned the pages, reading about the daily struggles and small victories of building a life in the wilderness. The writer's name was James Morrison, and he had been a soldier returning from World War II. The journal chronicled months of back-breaking labor as James and his family built their dream home log by log. Stone by stone, June 3rd, 1943, finished the foundation today. Mary came up with baby Sarah and a picnic lunch. She's starting to believe this crazy dream might actually work. Tommy wants to learn carpentry, so I'm teaching him to use the hand tools. Says he wants to build a cabin of his own someday. Entry after entry revealed a man fighting his own demons while building something beautiful for his family. James wrote about sleepless nights when the war memories came flooding back, and peaceful mornings when the work helped quiet his troubled mind. He described teaching his son Tommy the skills Samuel's own grandfather had passed down: how to read wood, grain, how to fit joints without nails, how to respect the materials and the land. August 12th, 1943. The walls are up and the roof is on. Tommy and I installed the windows today, real glass windows that Mary ordered from Denver. The light streaming in makes the whole place feel alive. I think we might actually make it here. The nightmares come less frequently now, but as Samuel read deeper into the journal, the entries began to change. James wrote about harsh winters, failed crops, and growing isolation. Mary grew homesick for her family back east. Tommy struggled with the remote schooling. The optimism of the early entries gradually gave way to doubt and desperation. November 18th, 1945. Mary's made up her mind. She's taking the children back to her mother's house in Ohio. Says the mountains are no place to raise children, that I'm being selfish keeping them here. Maybe she's right. Maybe some dreams are too expensive. The final entry, dated December 1st, 1945, was brief and heartbreaking. Locked up the cabin today. Mary and the children are already gone. The silence is too much now, even for me. Maybe someday Tommy will come back and understand what I was trying to build here. Maybe someday someone will finish what we started. Samuel closed the journal and sat quietly for a long time, feeling the weight of James Morrison's broken dreams. But where others might have seen only failure, Samuel saw something different. He saw a man who had almost succeeded, who had built something beautiful and strong before circumstances forced him to abandon it. Looking around the ruined cabin with new understanding, Samuel could envision it as it had been, windows gleaming in the mountain sunlight, smoke curling from the chimney, a family working together to carve a life from the wilderness. James Morrison had proven it could be done. The bones of his success still stood, waiting for someone with enough determination to bring them back to life. Samuel picked up a piece of fallen timber and began dragging it away from the main structure. The real work was about to begin. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the mountain clearing as Samuel pried apart the collapsed roof timbers. Each piece had to be examined carefully. Some were too rotted to salvage, their centers eaten away by decades of moisture and insects. Others, protected by the oil and pitch that James Morrison had used to seal them, remained solid enough to reuse. Samuel worked methodically, the way his grandfather had taught him to approach any large task. Break it into smaller pieces, tackle one section at a time, and never rush the assessment phase. Measure twice, cut once, the old man had always said, and Samuel found comfort in the familiar rhythm of careful evaluation followed by decisive action. By midday, he had cleared enough debris to expose the cabin's original floor plan. The main room was larger than he had first realized, roughly 16 feet square, with a massive stone fireplace dominating the western wall. A smaller room to the north had served as a bedroom, while a lean-to addition on the south side had housed the kitchen area. As he worked, Samuel became aware that he was not alone in the clearing. A red squirrel had taken up residence in a nearby pine, chattering commentary on his activities with what sounded like approval. A family of chipmunks watched from the safety of the woodpile, their dark eyes bright with curiosity. Even a young doe ventured to the clearing's edge, observing this strange human child who moved with such purpose through the ruins. The presence of the woodland creatures brought back memories of his grandfather's cabin, where similar animals had served as companionship during long summer days. "Wildlife knows good intentions," his grandfather had explained. "They can sense when someone means to build rather than destroy." It was while dragging a particularly heavy beam away from the main structure that Samuel made a discovery that changed everything. The timber had been pinning down his own backpack, which had somehow worked its way deeper into the debris during the night. As he pulled the pack free, he heard the distinctive rattle of metal tools. With trembling fingers, Samuel unzipped a compartment he had forgotten existed. Inside, wrapped in his grandfather's old flannel shirt, lay a small metal toolbox. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he lifted it out. He remembered this box from their last summer together, though he had never seen inside it. The latch opened with a satisfying click, revealing an array of hand tools that made Samuel's heart race with possibility. A small hand saw with a sharp, well-maintained blade, a set of chisels in graduated sizes, a measuring square made of polished hardwood, a collection of drill bits and metal punches, and most precious of all, a leather tool roll containing his grandfather's finest woodworking implements. Small planes, carving knives, and delicate gouges that could shape wood into works of art tucked into the lid of the toolbox. Samuel found a folded piece of paper with his name written on it in his grandfather's familiar handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it. "Samuel, if you're reading this, then you found yourself in a situation where these tools might mean the difference between giving up and pressing on. I always knew you had the mind for building, and I hope I taught you enough about using your hands to make something good in this world. These tools belonged to my father and his father before him. Now they belong to you. Use them well, and remember that the most important tool is the one between your ears. Love, Grandpa." Samuel sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this gift. His grandfather had somehow known, even before Samuel himself had understood, that these tools would be needed. The old man had prepared for this moment, packing the toolbox where Samuel would discover it when hope seemed most distant. With renewed energy, Samuel began sorting through the salvageable materials around the cabin site. James Morrison had been a skilled builder, and much of his work could be preserved with careful restoration. The main support posts were solid, needing only minor repairs. Several wall logs could be reused after removing the rotted chinking between them. Even some of the hand-split shingles from the collapsed roof remained in good condition. Using his grandfather's measuring square, Samuel began laying out a plan for the reconstruction. He would start with the foundation, ensuring it was level and properly drained. Then he would rebuild the frame structure, incorporating the salvageable timbers from James Morrison's original work. The walls would go up section by section, and finally he would tackle the complex geometry of the roof. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel found himself falling into the meditative rhythm of purposeful work. Each board he examined, each measurement he took, each small repair he completed, brought him closer to his goal. The forest animals settled into acceptance of his presence, and the red squirrel even ventured down from his tree to investigate the toolbox. By evening, Samuel had accomplished more than he had thought possible. The cabin's footprint was completely cleared. The foundation stones were cleaned and assessed, and he had sorted the salvageable materials into organized piles. Most importantly, he had a plan and the tools to execute it. As darkness fell, Samuel built a small fire in what remained of the old fireplace. The chimney drew well, sending smoke up through the broken stonework toward the stars. He cooked a simple meal of wild greens and the last of his stored food, then spent the evening by firelight, examining each tool in his grandfather's collection and planning the work ahead. Tomorrow, the real construction would begin. The sound that woke Samuel on his 6th morning in the wilderness was unfamiliar, a rhythmic clanking that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the eastern ridge. He lay still in his pine bough bed, listening carefully as his grandfather had taught him to do when encountering anything new in the forest. The sound came again, metal striking metal in a pattern too regular to be natural. After a breakfast of pine needle tea and wild berries, Samuel followed the sound up a steep game trail that wound between massive granite boulders. The climb was treacherous, but his weeks of wilderness living had strengthened his legs and sharpened his balance. At the ridge's crest, he discovered something that made his heart race with possibility. Below him, cutting through a narrow valley, lay the rusted remains of an old railroad track. The rails themselves had been removed long ago, probably during one of the wars when metal was scarce, but the railroad ties remained. Hundreds of them, stretching into the distance like a wooden pathway through the forest. And scattered along the abandoned roadbed were pieces of metal hardware that had once held the rails in place, iron spikes, steel plates, and heavy bolts that rang like bells when the wind moved them. Samuel scrambled down into the valley, his mind already racing with possibilities. Railroad ties were made from the finest timber, treated with creosote to resist rot and insects. They would make perfect foundation beams for his cabin reconstruction. The metal hardware could be fashioned into hinges, brackets, and reinforcements that would make his building stronger than anything James Morrison could have achieved with hand tools alone. But retrieving the materials would require more than enthusiasm. A single railroad tie weighed over 200 pounds, far too heavy for a 12-year-old boy to move alone. Samuel would need to think like an engineer, using leverage and ingenuity to accomplish what brute strength could not. He spent the morning studying the problem, walking the length of the abandoned track and cataloguing what was available. Near what had once been a water stop, he found the remains of a loading platform and the rusted framework of a hand-powered rail cart. Most of the cart had been stripped away, but the iron wheels and axle assembly remained intact. Samuel returned to his cabin site and retrieved his grandfather's tools, along with some rope he had salvaged from the debris. The next 3 days were spent in careful engineering, building a makeshift sled that could transport the heavy railroad ties down the mountain. Using principles his grandfather had taught him about mechanical advantage, Samuel constructed a system of pulleys and levers that allowed him to move objects many times his own weight. The work was exhausting and often dangerous. One tie slipped from his improvised sled and nearly crushed his leg. Another time, the rope snapped under load and sent him tumbling backward into a thicket of brambles. But with each successful transport, Samuel's confidence grew. He was learning skills that went beyond anything his grandfather had taught him, solving problems through trial and error and careful observation. As he worked, Samuel found himself developing relationships with the forest animals that had initially viewed him with suspicion. The red squirrel, whom he had begun calling Chester, often rode along on the railroad tie sled, chattering encouragement during the difficult passages. A family of raccoons discovered that his work sometimes exposed grubs and insects, and they began following his activities like a cleanup crew. Most surprising was the young black bear that appeared on his 10th day of hauling materials. Samuel's first instinct was fear, but the bear showed no aggression. Instead, it seemed curious about the strange human activities in its territory. Samuel remembered his grandfather's advice about wildlife. Respect them, give them space, but don't assume they mean harm unless they show it. The bear, whom Samuel began thinking of as Bruno, became a regular observer of the construction work. It seemed particularly fascinated by the mechanical aspects of Samuel's engineering solutions, sometimes sitting for hours watching the pulley systems in operation. Samuel found the creature's presence oddly comforting, as if even the forest's most powerful residents approved of his project. By the end of 2 weeks, Samuel had transported enough railroad ties to reconstruct the cabin's entire foundation system. More importantly, he had learned advanced problem-solving skills that would serve him throughout the construction process. He had discovered that every challenge had a solution if he was willing to think creatively and work patiently. On the evening of his 14th day, Samuel sat beside his fire, examining a massive iron railroad spike he had retrieved that afternoon. The spike was over 6 inches long and forged from high-quality steel. In his grandfather's hands, such a piece of metal could become a dozen different tools: punches, chisels, wedges, or pry bars. Samuel held the spike up to the firelight, feeling its weight and balance. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate work of forging his own tools from the railroad hardware. The cabin reconstruction was becoming more than just a building project. It was becoming an education in self-reliance that would serve him for the rest of his life. Chester the squirrel chittered from his perch in the nearby pine, and somewhere in the darkness, Bruno the bear shuffled through the underbrush. Samuel was no longer alone in the wilderness. He had built a community of unlikely companions, both human and animal, who shared his vision of creating something permanent and beautiful in this remote place. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning when the autumn air carried the first real bite of approaching winter. Samuel had been working on the cabin's north wall, fitting a particularly stubborn log into place, when the makeshift scaffold he had built from salvaged lumber gave way beneath him. He fell 8 feet, landing hard on a pile of railroad ties with his left arm twisted beneath his body. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Samuel lay motionless for several minutes, fighting waves of nausea and trying to assess the damage. His arm throbbed with a deep grinding ache that suggested something more serious than a simple bruise. When he finally managed to sit up, he could see that his wrist was swollen and already beginning to discolor. For the first time since beginning his mountain odyssey, Samuel felt the full weight of his isolation. There was no one to call for help, no hospital within 50 miles, no adult to make decisions about his care. He was 12 years old, alone in the wilderness, and possibly seriously injured, but panic would not serve him now. Samuel forced himself to breathe slowly and think through the situation as his grandfather would have done. The old man had been a medic in Vietnam and had taught Samuel basic first aid during their summers together. More importantly, he had taught him that clear thinking was the most valuable tool in any emergency. Samuel carefully examined his injured arm, moving his fingers and testing his range of motion. The pain was severe, but he could move everything. No bones were obviously broken, though he suspected he had sprained his wrist badly. Using strips torn from his flannel shirt, he fashioned a crude sling to immobilize the joint. The greater challenge would be continuing his work with only one functional hand. Winter was approaching rapidly, and Samuel could already see snow on the highest peaks. The cabin needed to be weatherproof within weeks, or he would not survive until spring. That evening, as Samuel sat by his fire nursing his injury, he made a discovery that would change his relationship with the wilderness forever. While searching through the debris around the old cabin site, he had found a small glass medicine bottle with a handwritten label that read, "Willow bark extract for pain and fever." The bottle was empty, but it reminded Samuel of lessons his grandfather had taught him about natural remedies. Willow trees grew abundantly along the stream that ran past his clearing, and Samuel remembered that their inner bark contained compounds similar to modern aspirin. Working carefully with his one good hand, he harvested bark from young willow branches and prepared it the way his grandfather had shown him, scraping the inner bark into fine shavings, then steeping them in hot water to make a bitter but effective tea. The willow bark tea did indeed reduce his pain, but more importantly, the process of making it connected Samuel to generations of people who had lived and healed themselves from the land. James Morrison had probably used similar remedies during his time in the cabin. Indigenous peoples had certainly used these same plants for thousands of years before any European settlers arrived. Over the following days, as Samuel adapted his work methods to accommodate his injury, he found himself paying attention to the natural world in new ways. He noticed which plants the deer browsed on, which berries the birds preferred, which areas of the forest provided the best materials for different purposes. The wilderness was not just a backdrop for his construction project. It was a vast library of knowledge waiting to be read by anyone willing to learn its language. Working one-handed forced Samuel to become more ingenious in his building methods. He developed new ways to leverage heavy timbers into place, created pulley systems that required less direct force, and learned to pace himself more carefully. The injury that had seemed like a catastrophe became a teacher, showing him that limitations could spark creativity rather than defeat it. Chester the squirrel seemed to sense Samuel's vulnerability and began staying closer to the worksite, as if standing guard. Bruno the bear appeared more frequently, sometimes sitting at the clearing's edge for hours, a massive and oddly comforting presence. Even the ravens that lived in the tall pines began dropping twigs and small objects near Samuel's workspace, as if contributing to the construction effort. As his wrist slowly healed over the course of 2 weeks, Samuel realized that his relationship with the mountain wilderness had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just surviving in it or building upon it. He was becoming part of it, learning to read its moods and seasons, understanding its rhythms and resources. The old medicine bottle sat on a shelf he had built inside the partially reconstructed cabin, a reminder of the knowledge that connected him to everyone who had ever called this place home. Samuel was not the first person to face challenges here, and he would not be the last. But he was learning that the land itself was a teacher, offering its lessons to anyone brave enough to listen and humble enough to learn. Samuel was splitting, kindling behind the partially rebuilt cabin when he heard the sound that had become foreign to his ears after weeks of wilderness solitude. A human voice calling for help. The cry was weak and desperate, coming from somewhere beyond the eastern ridge, where the old railroad track wound through the forest. Setting down his axe, Samuel listened carefully. The call came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of someone crashing through underbrush with little regard for stealth or safety. Samuel's first instinct was to hide. He had grown comfortable with his isolation and was not certain he wanted to share his secret project with the outside world. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. A man's character is measured by what he does when no one is watching, and by how he treats those who need help. Samuel grabbed his water bottle and a handful of wild berries, then headed toward the sounds of distress. He found the stranger collapsed beside the old railroad grade, a man in his 60s wearing expensive hiking gear that had been shredded by brambles and rough travel. Blood seeped through a makeshift bandage on his left leg, and his face was pale with exhaustion and pain. "Please," the man gasped when he saw Samuel approaching. "I've been lost for 2 days. My GPS died and I took a bad fall yesterday. I think my leg might be broken." Samuel knelt beside the injured hiker, his mind automatically shifting into the emergency procedures his grandfather had taught him. The man's breathing was shallow but steady, his pulse rapid but strong. The leg injury looked serious, but not life-threatening. "My name's Samuel," he said, offering the man water. Let me take a look at that leg. The hiker's eyes widened as he really looked at Samuel for the first time. You're just a kid. What are you doing out here alone? Same thing you are, I expect, Samuel replied diplomatically. Trying to survive. He carefully examined the injured leg, noting the swelling and unnatural angle that suggested a fracture below the knee. This needs proper medical attention, but I can help stabilize it for now. As Samuel worked to splint the man's leg using techniques his grandfather had taught him, the hiker studied his young rescuer with growing amazement. You seem to know what you're doing. Are you camping nearby? Samuel gestured toward the clearing, where his cabin reconstruction project was taking shape. I live over there. When the man saw the partially rebuilt structure, his reaction was not what Samuel had expected. Instead of surprise or concern about a child living alone in the wilderness, the hiker's face filled with recognition and something that looked like reverence. My God, he whispered. That's Jim Morrison's place. I never thought I'd see it again. Samuel stopped working on the splint and stared at his patient. You knew James Morrison? Knew him? The man laughed weakly. Jim Morrison saved my life in Korea. I'm Henry Walsh. We served together in the 2nd Infantry Division. He pulled a set of tarnished dog tags from beneath his shirt. Jim gave me these when he thought he wasn't going to make it through a particularly bad battle. Said his family should know what happened to him if I made it home, and he didn't. Samuel's hands trembled as he finished securing the splint. He made it home. He built this cabin for his family. Henry nodded slowly. I heard about that. Heard he was trying to start over, get away from the nightmares and the crowds. A lot of us had trouble readjusting after the war. Jim had it worse than most. He saw things, did things that no man should have to carry alone. Over the next several hours, as Henry rested and recovered his strength, he told Samuel stories about James Morrison that the journal had never revealed. Jim had been a demolitions expert, skilled at building and destroying with equal expertise. He had also been a man haunted by the destruction he had caused, desperate to create something beautiful and lasting to balance the scales of his conscience. Jim was the best combat engineer I ever knew, Henry said, accepting another cup of willow bark tea that Samuel had prepared. He could build a bridge out of bamboo and rope that would hold a tank or level a mountain with explosives and precision timing. But what he really wanted was to build something that would last, something that would shelter the people he loved, instead of destroying the people he was ordered to fight. As evening approached, Henry examined Samuel's reconstruction work with the eyes of someone who understood both construction and the man who had originally built here. You're doing good work, son. Jim would be proud to see his place being restored with such care and skill. Samuel helped Henry down to the clearing, where the injured man could rest more comfortably while they decided what to do about getting him to medical care. But before they reached the cabin, Henry made an observation that changed Samuel's understanding of his entire project. You know, Henry said, studying the precisely fitted logs and carefully crafted joints, this isn't just rebuilding. This is honoring something. Jim always said that every building carries the soul of its maker. You're not just fixing his cabin, son. You're completing his dream. The first snowflakes began falling on a grey October morning while Samuel was installing the handmade weather vane on the cabin's newly completed roof. From his perch 20 feet above the ground, he watched the delicate white crystals drift down through the pine branches, each one a harbinger of the brutal winter that would soon grip the Colorado mountains. Henry Walsh had been gone for 3 days, carried out of the wilderness by a search and rescue team that Samuel had helped summon using Henry's emergency beacon. Before leaving, Henry had given Samuel something precious, James Morrison's original military dog tags, and a promise to keep the boy's location secret until spring. A man needs to finish what he starts, Henry had said. Jim would understand that better than anyone. Now, alone again in his mountain sanctuary, Samuel felt the weight of approaching winter like a physical presence. The weather vane he was installing had been forged from an old railroad spike, its arrow pointing steadily north toward the peaks already white with snow. It would serve both as a functional tool for reading wind patterns and as a symbol of his determination to weather whatever storms lay ahead. The cabin was nearly complete, but nearly would not be sufficient when the temperature dropped below zero and the snow began accumulating in earnest. Samuel had perhaps 2 weeks to finish the critical weatherproofing, sealing the final gaps between logs, installing the last windows he had salvaged and repaired, and ensuring that his chimney drew properly under all conditions. Working with renewed urgency, Samuel tackled each remaining task with methodical precision. He mixed mortar from clay he had found along the stream bank, adding lime from crushed limestone and horsehair from the tail of a wild horse he had befriended. The mixture would seal the spaces between logs, preventing wind and moisture from penetrating his walls. The windows presented a particular challenge. Samuel had found several intact window frames in the cabin's debris, but most of the glass was broken. Using techniques he had learned from his grandfather and refined through trial and error, he cut new panes from a piece of plate glass, salvaged from an old truck windshield he had discovered near the railroad track. Each piece had to be measured precisely, cut with patience, and installed with care. As he worked, Samuel found himself thinking about the stories Henry had shared about James Morrison. The original builder had been a man driven by demons, seeking peace through the act of creation. Samuel understood that drive now. Each board he fitted, each stone he placed, each joint he sealed was not just construction work. It was an act of faith in the future, a declaration that permanence was possible even in a world that seemed determined to tear things apart. The forest animals that had become his companions seemed to sense the urgency of his work. Chester the squirrel spent less time chattering and more time gathering nuts for winter storage. Bruno the bear appeared more frequently, as if checking on Samuel's progress before beginning his own preparations for hibernation. Even the ravens worked with unusual intensity, gathering materials for winter nests and caching food in hidden locations. Samuel's daily routine became a race against time and weather. He woke before dawn and worked until darkness, taking breaks only for quick meals and the brief rest periods his body demanded. His hands, already tough from weeks of manual labor, developed new calluses and scars. His shoulders and back ached constantly from lifting and fitting heavy timbers. But his spirit soared with each completed task. The root cellar behind the cabin became his focus for food storage. Samuel had spent weeks gathering wild nuts, drying berries, and smoking fish caught in the mountain stream. He had also learned to preserve meat from small game, using techniques his grandfather had taught him, combined with methods he found described in James Morrison's journal. The cellar would keep his supplies frozen through the winter months, ensuring he would not starve before spring. Firewood presented another massive challenge. Samuel calculated that he would need at least 10 full cords of seasoned wood to heat the cabin through a mountain winter. Working alone with hand tools, cutting and splitting that much wood seemed impossible. But Samuel had learned that impossible was simply another word for difficult. And difficult problems yielded to patience and determination. He established a rhythm, mornings for construction work while his energy was highest, afternoons for wood cutting and splitting, evenings for maintenance tasks like tool sharpening and equipment repair. Each day brought visible progress, but each day also brought the temperature a few degrees lower and the snow line a few hundred feet closer to his elevation. On the evening when Samuel installed the final window, sealing the last major opening in his fortress against winter, he stood back and surveyed what he had accomplished. The cabin stood solid and true, its walls tight and its roof sound. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, and warm light glowed from windows that would keep out the worst weather the mountains could deliver. Samuel touched the weather vane's arrow as it swung in the evening breeze, pointing toward the challenges that lay ahead. Winter was coming, but he was ready. The storm began as a whisper of wind through the pine tops, so gentle that Samuel almost ignored it while he carved the final details into a wooden cross he had been working on during the long evenings. He had made the cross from a piece of heartwood salvaged from James Morrison's original construction, and it was intended as both a memorial to the cabin's first builder and a symbol of gratitude for his own survival. But the whisper became a moan, then a howl, and by midnight the first blizzard of winter was unleashing its full fury on the mountain wilderness. Samuel had experienced mountain storms before, but nothing had prepared him for the raw power of this early season hurricane of snow and wind. The cabin shuddered under the assault. Wind-driven snow found every tiny gap in the construction, creating small drifts in corners where Samuel thought he had achieved perfect sealing. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the stones of the fireplace contracted with sharp cracking sounds, and frost began forming on the interior walls despite the fire burning steadily in the hearth. Samuel spent the first night of the storm moving constantly through the cabin, monitoring for problems and making small repairs as they became necessary. A piece of metal roofing worked loose and had to be secured with additional nails driven through the storm. A window frame shifted slightly under the pressure, requiring new chinking to maintain the seal. The chimney drew inconsistently as the wind changed direction, sometimes filling the cabin with smoke that made his eyes water and his throat burn. By dawn, 3 feet of snow had accumulated around the cabin walls, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. Samuel realized with growing concern that this might be more than a typical early winter squall. The weather vane he had installed spun wildly, unable to settle on any direction as the wind swirled and eddied around the clearing. On the second day, the real test began. The weight of accumulating snow stressed the roof structure, and Samuel could hear the timbers groaning under the load. He had built the roof strong, following James Morrison's original design and reinforcing it with additional supports. But he had never expected to face such conditions so early in the season. Working by firelight, Samuel used techniques his grandfather had taught him for emergency repairs. He braced the ceiling joists with additional supports cut from his carefully hoarded lumber supply. He redistributed the load by creating new support points where the stress seemed greatest. Most importantly, he maintained his calm and worked methodically, never allowing panic to cloud his judgment. The third night brought the storm's most dangerous phase. The wind reached velocities that seemed impossible, shaking the entire cabin like a toy in the hands of an angry giant. Samuel lay awake, listening to trees falling in the forest around him, massive pines that had stood for decades, crashing to earth with sounds like thunder. At some point during that endless night, Samuel realized that his survival was no longer certain. The cabin was holding, but barely. If the roof failed or the walls buckled, he would face the storm with only the clothes on his back and whatever supplies he could grab in the final moments. The nearest shelter was 40 miles away through terrain that would be impassable in these conditions. It was then that Samuel reached for the wooden cross he had been carving, holding it in his hands as he had seen his grandfather do during moments of uncertainty. The old man had not been particularly religious, but he had understood the power of ritual and symbol to focus the mind and strengthen the spirit. "If I don't make it through this," Samuel whispered to the wooden cross, "let someone find this place and know that I tried. Let them know that James Morrison's dream was worth rebuilding, even if I wasn't strong enough to see it through." But as dawn broke on the fourth day, the wind began to moderate. The snow continued falling, but without the driving force that had made it a weapon. Samuel ventured outside for the first time in 3 days and found a transformed world. The cabin sat in a bowl of white that reached nearly to the windows. Drifts had formed against the north wall that were taller than Samuel himself. More importantly, the cabin had held. Every joint remained tight, every window intact, every support beam strong and true. The roof showed no signs of stress damage, and the chimney continued to draw properly, despite being nearly buried in snow. Standing in the doorway, looking out at a wilderness made alien by the storm's fury, Samuel felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went beyond mere survival. He had built something that could withstand the worst nature could deliver. More than that, he had proven to himself that the skills and values his grandfather had taught him were not just old-fashioned wisdom, but practical tools for creating something permanent in an impermanent world. Samuel placed the wooden cross on a shelf beside James Morrison's photograph, a reminder that some dreams are strong enough to survive any storm. Spring came to the mountains like a gentle awakening after a long dream. Samuel first noticed it in the changing quality of light that filtered through his cabin windows. No longer the harsh glare of sun on snow, but the softer illumination of longer days and melting ice. The sounds changed too, the drip of water from eaves, the distant murmur of the stream running free again, and somewhere in the forest, the tentative calls of birds returning from their winter refuges. Samuel had survived. More than survived, he had thrived. The long winter months had been a time of reflection and quiet productivity. He had spent the short days carving furniture from salvaged wood, crafting tools and utensils, and reading James Morrison's journal again and again until he felt he knew the man like family. The long evenings had been filled with planning improvements for the coming year and dreaming of the garden he would plant when the ground thawed. The cabin had proven itself through months of brutal weather. Not once had the roof leaked or the walls shifted. The fireplace had drawn perfectly through the worst storms, and the carefully sealed windows had kept out wind and cold while letting in precious light. Samuel had created something worthy of pride. Something that honored both his grandfather's teachings and James Morrison's original vision. On a warm morning in early April, when the snow had retreated to patches in the deepest shadows, Samuel heard voices approaching through the forest. He recognized them as human long before they reached his clearing, but after months of solitude, the sound seemed as foreign as bird calls in a different language. 3 hikers emerged from the trees, a middle-aged couple and their teenage son, all wearing expensive outdoor gear and carrying lightweight packs. They stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared in amazement at what they found there. The cabin stood like something from a fairy tale, perfectly proportioned and beautifully crafted. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight column in the still air. Window boxes that Samuel had built and installed held the first green shoots of wild plants he had transplanted from the forest. A neat woodpile stood against the south wall, and a garden plot had been prepared and planted with seeds Samuel had collected and saved. "My God," the woman whispered. "Look at the craftsmanship. Those joints are perfect. And is that hand-split roofing?" Samuel appeared in the doorway, wearing clothes he had mended and patched through the winter, but carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven his capabilities beyond any doubt. He was taller than he had been 6 months earlier, broader in the shoulders, and his hands bore the permanent marks of skilled manual work. "Good morning," he said politely, the way his grandfather had taught him to greet visitors. "Welcome to my home." The family exchanged glances of confusion and amazement. "Your home?" the father asked. "Son, how old are you?" 13 last month, Samuel replied. "I built this place myself, though I had help from someone who came before me." As the morning progressed, Samuel told his story to the fascinated hikers. He showed them through the cabin, explaining how he had salvaged materials, solved engineering problems, and survived the winter alone. He shared the story of James Morrison and the legacy that had inspired his work. Most importantly, he demonstrated that he was not a lost child in need of rescue, but a capable young man who had found his place in the world. The teenage son was particularly impressed by Samuel's workshop, where hand-forged tools hung in neat rows, and half-finished projects demonstrated ongoing creativity and skill. "How did you learn to do all this?" he asked. "My grandfather taught me the basics," Samuel replied. "The rest I figured out as I went along. When you have no choice but to solve a problem, you discover you're more capable than you ever imagined." Before the family left, they helped Samuel plant wildflower seeds around the cabin's perimeter. The woman had brought a packet of mixed seeds for her own garden, but she insisted that Samuel's home deserved flowers. As they worked together in the warm dirt, Samuel felt a connection to the wider world that he had not experienced since his abandonment. "Will you stay here?" the father asked as they prepared to continue their hike. Samuel looked around at the clearing where he had spent the most transformative months of his life. The cabin stood solid and welcoming, a testament to the power of determination and skill. The forest around it had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. This place had become more than shelter. It had become home in the deepest sense of the word. "For now," Samuel said, "there's still work to do, and I want to see how the garden grows." As the hikers disappeared back into the forest, Samuel stood beside his cabin, holding a handful of wildflower seeds. Tomorrow, he would plant them in the spots that needed color. Next week, he would begin work on the lean-to addition he had planned. Next month, he would start the project of building furniture for the second bedroom. Samuel had learned that home was not something you were given, but something you created with your own hands and filled with your own dreams. The wildflower seeds were just the beginning. The discovery happened by accident, as the most meaningful findings often do. Samuel was digging a new drainage channel to direct spring runoff away from the cabin's foundation when his shovel struck something harder than dirt or stone. Kneeling in the rich earth that smelled of snowmelt and awakening life, he carefully brushed away the soil to reveal a carved cornerstone that had been buried beneath decades of accumulated debris. The stone was granite, probably quarried from the mountains nearby, and someone had taken considerable time to shape and engrave it. On its face, carved in letters deep enough to survive weather and time, Samuel read, "J. Morrison, 1943, built with hope." Below the inscription, someone had carved a simple symbol, two hands clasped in partnership, representing the cooperation between builder and land that made permanent shelter possible. Samuel sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the weight of this discovery. This was not just James Morrison's signature on his work. It was his declaration of faith in the future, his belief that what he was creating would outlast the troubles that had driven him to seek peace in the wilderness. The cornerstone had been placed with ceremony and intention, marking the moment when dream became reality. Working carefully through the afternoon, Samuel excavated around the stone until he could see how it had been positioned within the original foundation. Morrison had placed it at the southeast corner, where the morning sun would touch it first each day. The stone had been set in a bed of smaller rocks, creating a foundation that was both functional and symbolic. As Samuel cleaned the carved letters with a soft brush, he noticed something else. Faint marks scratched into the stone surface that were not part of the original inscription. Looking closer, he realized these were tally marks, dozens of them, arranged in groups of 5. Someone had been counting something, marking days or weeks or months directly onto the cornerstone. That evening, by the light of his oil lamp, Samuel counted the marks carefully. There were exactly 120 of them, the same number of days he had spent rebuilding the cabin. James Morrison had marked each day of his own construction project on this stone. creating a record of persistence and determination that Samuel now shared. The realization filled Samuel with a profound sense of connection that transcended time and circumstance. He and James Morrison had faced similar challenges, felt similar doubts, and found similar strength in the daily act of building something permanent. The cornerstone was not just a marker of Morrison's achievement. It was a bridge between past and present, connecting two builders across the decades. Samuel spent the next several days researching what he could learn about cornerstones and their significance in building traditions. Using books he had found in the cabin's debris and knowledge his grandfather had shared, he discovered that cornerstone ceremonies had been practiced for thousands of years. Ancient builders believed that the cornerstone contained the soul of the building, and that proper placement ensured the structure would stand against all challenges. Understanding this tradition, Samuel realized he had a choice to make. He could restore Morrison's cornerstone to its original position, honoring the past and maintaining the connection to the cabin's first builder. Or he could place his own cornerstone alongside Morrison's, marking his own contribution to the building's story. The decision came to him during a morning walk through the forest, where he noticed how new trees often grew beside the stumps of their predecessors, creating continuity while adding fresh life to the woodland community. The cabin could honor both its original builder and its restorer, without diminishing either contribution. Samuel spent a week preparing his own cornerstone. Carved from granite, he quarried himself using techniques Morrison had described in his journal. The work was slow and painstaking, requiring precision and patience. On his stone, Samuel carved S. Walker 2024, built with gratitude. Below the inscription, he added his own symbol, a compass rose pointing in all directions, representing the guidance he had received from past wisdom and his commitment to sharing that wisdom with future generations. The ceremony of placing both cornerstones took place on a clear morning when the mountain air was sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Samuel positioned Morrison's stone in its original location, then placed his own beside it at the southwest corner. Together, the stones created a foundation that honored both past and present, linking the dreams of two builders across generations. As Samuel stood back and surveyed his work, he understood that he had become more than just the cabin's restorer. He had become its historian, its protector, and its bridge to whatever future awaited this place. The cornerstones would outlast both builders, carrying their stories forward to inspire others who might face similar challenges and choose similar courage. Chester the squirrel chittered approval from his perch in the nearby pine, and somewhere in the forest, birds sang the ancient songs of renewal and continuity. The cabin now had roots that reached deeper than its physical foundation, anchored in the bedrock of human determination and hope. The basket took Samuel 3 weeks to complete, working in the evenings by firelight when the day's construction tasks were finished. He had started the project out of necessity, needing something to carry wild berries and nuts during his foraging expeditions. But as the work progressed, it became something much more significant, a meditation on patience, tradition, and the satisfaction that comes from creating beauty with one's own hands. Samuel had learned the basics of basket weaving from his grandfather during one of their summer sessions, but those childhood lessons had focused more on the principles than the practice. Now working alone in his mountain cabin with only memory and determination as guides, Samuel rediscovered the ancient rhythm of weaving plant fibers into useful forms. The materials came from the forest around his clearing. Young willow shoots provided the flexible framework, while strips of birch bark and pine needles created the weaving medium. Samuel gathered these materials during his daily walks, learning to read the forest like a catalogue of available resources. Each tree, each shrub, each ground cover plant offered something useful to someone willing to learn its properties. The actual weaving required a patience that modern life had never taught Samuel to cultivate. Each strand had to be selected for strength and flexibility, then worked into the growing pattern with care and attention. Mistakes could not simply be erased and corrected. They had to be unwoven strand by strand until the error was removed and the work could continue. During the long evenings of basket construction, Samuel found his mind settling into a meditative state that his grandfather had called the craftsman's peace. The repetitive motions of weaving became automatic, freeing his thoughts to wander through memories and plans, problems and possibilities. He understood why traditional craftspeople had spoken of their work as spiritual practice as much as practical skill. The finished basket was beautiful in its simplicity, perfectly proportioned and strong enough to carry considerable weight. But more than a useful tool, it represented Samuel's growing independence from the manufactured world. He was learning to create everything he needed from materials the earth provided freely to anyone willing to invest time and effort in learning traditional skills. The basket project sparked others. Samuel began making rope from twisted plant fibers, using techniques he found described in James Morrison's journal and refined through experimentation. He carved wooden bowls and spoons from fallen timber, each piece shaped to fit his hands and serve his specific needs. He learned to make soap from wood ash and animal fat, candles from rendered tallow, and dyes from berries and bark. Each new skill connected Samuel to generations of people who had lived from the land, creating what they needed rather than purchasing what others had made. He began to understand that self-sufficiency was not just about survival. It was about maintaining connection to the fundamental processes that sustained human life. When you made your own tools, grew your own food, and built your own shelter, you understood your place in the natural world in ways that no amount of book learning could provide. The workshop area of his cabin gradually filled with the tools and products of his expanding craftsmanship. Hand-forged chisels hung beside carved wooden mallets. Coiled rope sat next to bundles of prepared fiber. Finished baskets in various sizes served different purposes: berry gathering, root storage, firewood carrying, and general transport. Samuel's daily routine expanded to include maintenance and creation of his growing inventory of handmade goods. Morning hours were devoted to essential tasks, tending his garden, maintaining the cabin structure, and gathering food. Afternoons involved heavier work, cutting firewood, hauling water, and major construction projects. But evenings belonged to craftwork, the quiet hours when his hands could create beauty, while his mind processed the experiences of each day. Visitors to the cabin, which were becoming more frequent as word of Samuel's achievement spread among hikers and outdoor enthusiasts, were always amazed by the completeness of his self-sufficient lifestyle. They saw not just a rebuilt cabin, but an entire way of life that demonstrated what was possible when someone committed fully to living from their own skills and the resources of the land. One evening, as Samuel worked on a new basket while rain drummed against his windows, he realized that he had achieved something remarkable. He was no longer dependent on the outside world for his basic needs. Food, shelter, tools, clothing, medicine, and entertainment all came from his own efforts and the generous abundance of the mountain wilderness. The hand-woven basket sitting beside his chair represented more than portable storage. It symbolized the possibility of true independence, the kind of self-reliance that his grandfather had taught him to value above all other achievements. Samuel had learned that freedom was not something granted by others, but something created through knowledge, skill, and the willingness to work with one's hands. Outside his warm cabin, the forest settled into evening quiet, and Samuel continued weaving, adding another strand to the growing pattern of his mountain life. The idea for the flute came to Samuel during one of the longest nights of winter, when the silence outside his cabin felt so complete that it seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. He had been reading James Morrison's journal by lamplight, searching for techniques to improve his woodworking skills, when he found an entry that stopped him cold. February 14th, 1944, made a whistle for Tommy today from a piece of birch. The boy's been so quiet since Mary took him to town for supplies. Says the silence here scares him sometimes. Music helps, even simple music. Reminds us that humans make beauty, not just shelter. Samuel set down the journal and listened to the profound quiet surrounding his cabin. Snow muffled every sound from the outside world, and the only noise came from the settling of timbers and the occasional pop of sap in the fireplace logs. He had grown accustomed to the silence, even found comfort in it. But Morrison's words made him realize what was missing, the human element of joy and celebration that music represents. The next morning, Samuel began searching the forest for the right piece of wood for a flute. His grandfather had never taught him instrument making, but he had shown Samuel how to read wood grain and select materials for specific purposes. A flute would require wood that was both resonant and workable, dense enough to produce clear tones, but soft enough to carve with precision. He found what he needed in a fallen apple tree that had somehow taken root in the mountain soil decades earlier, probably grown from seeds carried by birds or early settlers. The wood was seasoned to perfection by years of mountain weather, and when Samuel tapped it with his knuckle, it rang with a clear, musical tone that promised good acoustic properties. Carving the flute became Samuel's winter project, a task he approached during the shortest days, when outdoor work was limited and the evenings stretched endlessly towards spring. Using techniques adapted from his general woodworking knowledge, Samuel slowly shaped the piece of apple wood into an instrument. The work required a delicacy he had never needed for construction projects. Every cut had to be precise, every surface smooth, every hole positioned exactly to produce the proper pitch. Samuel made dozens of small mistakes and had to start over twice when errors became too significant to correct. But each failure taught him something about the relationship between form and function that applied to all craftsmanship. The mathematical precision required for proper hole placement challenged Samuel in new ways. He had to learn about ratios and proportions, discovering that music followed natural laws as predictable as those governing structural engineering. The distance between holes determined the intervals between notes, and those intervals had to follow patterns that produced harmony rather than discord. As winter progressed and the flute took shape, Samuel found himself looking forward to the evening carving sessions with anticipation that surprised him. After months of practical work focused on survival and shelter, the act of creating something purely for beauty and joy felt like a luxury almost too precious to allow himself. When Samuel finally carved the last hole and smoothed the final surface, he held in his hands an instrument that was unmistakably his own creation. The wood gleamed with the patina that came from hours of careful handling, and the proportions reflected his own hands and breath rather than any standardized measurements. The first notes Samuel coaxed from his handmade flute were tentative and breathy, more sighs than music. But as he learned to control his breathing and finger placement, actual melodies began to emerge. Simple folk tunes his grandfather had hummed during their work sessions. Traditional songs his mother had sung during the brief happy periods of his childhood. New melodies that seemed to flow from the mountains themselves. Music transformed Samuel's relationship with solitude. Where silence had once felt complete and sufficient, he now understood it as a canvas, waiting for the human voice of melody and rhythm. The flute became his companion during long winter evenings, filling the cabin with sounds that connected him to the broader human experience of making beauty from simple materials. Playing the flute also connected Samuel to the emotional landscape he had largely ignored while focused on physical survival. Music had a way of accessing feelings that practical work kept buried: loneliness, wonder, gratitude, and a deep appreciation for the strange journey that had brought him to this place of independence and peace. On clear nights, Samuel took his flute outside and played simple melodies under the star-filled mountain sky. The notes seemed to carry for miles in the thin air, creating connections with the vast wilderness that surrounded his small clearing. He imagined that somewhere in the forest, James Morrison's spirit was listening and approving of this addition to the cabin's legacy. The wooden flute represented something Samuel was just beginning to understand: that survival was not enough, and neither was mere comfort. Human beings needed beauty, creativity, and the expression of joy to make life complete. The flute was his declaration that he was not just surviving in the wilderness, but truly living there. Samuel's first garden hoe was a masterpiece of practical engineering, forged from a railroad spike during the long winter evenings when outdoor work was impossible. He had heated the iron in his fireplace until it glowed orange, then hammered it against a granite anvil he had positioned near the hearth. The blade was narrow but sharp, designed for the precise work of cultivating soil in the rocky mountain terrain around his cabin. Spring arrived late to the high country, but when it came, it brought an explosion of growth that transformed the mountain landscape almost overnight. Snow retreated to shadowed hollows, revealing earth that was rich and dark with decades of decomposed organic matter. Samuel had spent the winter studying seed catalogues and agricultural guides he had found among James Morrison's possessions, preparing for this moment when he could finally test his theories about mountain farming. The garden plot Samuel had chosen lay on the south-facing slope behind his cabin, where it would receive maximum sunlight during the short growing season. The soil was better than he had hoped: deep forest loam mixed with granite sand that provided excellent drainage. But it was also filled with roots, rocks, and the accumulated debris of years without cultivation. Breaking ground with his handmade hoe, Samuel discovered that gardening was unlike any other work he had undertaken. Construction projects had clear beginning and ending points, with progress measured by visible completion of specific tasks. Gardening operated on natural rhythms that could not be rushed or controlled, demanding patience and faith in processes that unfolded over months rather than days. The physical work of preparing the garden plot was more challenging than Samuel had expected. Every square foot of soil had to be turned, examined, and cleared of obstacles. Rocks ranged from pebbles to boulders, each requiring different removal strategies. Root systems from nearby trees had to be cut and extracted without damaging the living trees themselves. Organic matter had to be incorporated evenly to ensure consistent soil fertility. Samuel worked section by section, completing small areas thoroughly before moving on to new ground. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory: "Good farming starts with good soil preparation. You can't shortcut the foundation work and expect strong results." Each day brought visible progress, but each day also revealed new challenges that required creative solutions. The seeds Samuel planted came from multiple sources. Some were commercial varieties he had discovered in Morrison's abandoned supplies, carefully stored in sealed containers that had protected them from moisture and pests. Others were seeds he had collected during his autumn foraging expeditions: wild berries, edible roots, and native plants that were adapted to mountain conditions, Planting day arrived with the certainty of astronomical calculation. Samuel had learned to read the natural signs that mountain farmers had relied on for generations: soil temperature, day length, and the behavior of migrating birds. When the conditions aligned properly, he spent an entire day placing seeds in carefully measured rows, each variety positioned according to its specific needs for space, light, and water access. The waiting that followed planting was unlike anything Samuel had experienced. After months of immediate feedback from construction work, where each hammer blow produced visible results, gardening required faith in invisible processes. Seeds germinated in darkness, roots extended into unseen soil depths, and growth occurred too slowly to observe from day to day. Samuel developed new routines centered around garden care: morning inspections to check for pest damage or disease, afternoon watering sessions when natural rainfall was insufficient, evening planning sessions where he recorded observations and planned improvements. The garden became a teacher, instructing him in patience, observation, and the subtle art of working with natural forces rather than against them. The first green shoots appeared 3 weeks after planting, emerging from the dark soil like tiny flags of victory. Samuel felt a joy unlike any he had experienced during his wilderness adventure. These plants represented hope made visible, the transformation of faith and work into living abundance. As the growing season progressed, Samuel learned to read his garden like a complex text written in the language of leaf color, growth patterns, and soil conditions. Healthy plants displayed characteristic vigor and resilience. Stressed plants showed distress signals that could be interpreted and addressed before serious problems developed. The garden hoe became Samuel's most treasured tool, an extension of his hands that allowed him to cultivate, weed, and harvest with precision and efficiency. Each morning, he would spend time sharpening its blade and oiling its handle, maintaining the implement that connected him to the ancient tradition of growing food from soil and seed. By midsummer, Samuel's garden was producing more food than he could consume fresh. He learned preservation techniques from Morrison's journal and his own experimentation: drying, smoking, and root cellar storage. The garden had become more than a source of nutrition. It was a complete system that connected him to the seasonal rhythms that governed all life in the mountains. Standing among his thriving plants with the well-worn hoe in his hands, Samuel understood that he had learned something profound about time, patience, and the rewards that come to those who work in partnership with natural cycles. The measuring stick Samuel carved from a straight piece of ashwood was precisely 18 inches long, marked with careful notches every quarter-inch along its length. He had made it initially for cabinet work, needing accurate measurements for the furniture he was building to complete his cabin's interior. But as he worked with the tool day after day, it became something more significant. A physical reminder of how much he had grown in ways that could not be measured with any conventional ruler. The project began when Samuel realized that his construction work was suffering from imprecision. The furniture he was building from salvaged lumber required joints that fit perfectly, measurements that were consistent across multiple pieces, and angles that were exactly square. Working by eye and intuition had served him well for rough construction, but fine woodworking demanded accuracy that only proper measuring tools could provide. Samuel carved the ruler during evening sessions over the course of a week, working by oil lamplight with his grandfather's finest carving tools. The ashwood had come from a tree that had fallen during the previous winter storms, seasoned by months of mountain weather into a piece that was both hard and stable. Each mark had to be positioned exactly, using mathematical principles Samuel had learned in school, but never expected to apply in wilderness construction. The process of creating accurate measurements from raw wood taught Samuel about the fundamental relationship between precision and quality. Each notch required careful measurement from the previous mark, and small errors accumulated quickly if he was not vigilant. By the time he finished the ruler, Samuel understood why craftsmen throughout history had treasured their measuring tools as much as their cutting implements. But the physical ruler was only part of what Samuel was learning to measure. During his time in the mountains, as he used the tool for cabinet work and small repairs, he began thinking about the other kinds of growth that had occurred during his wilderness year. Changes that were real and significant but could not be quantified with notches on a piece of wood. When Samuel had first arrived at the ruined cabin, he could barely lift a railroad tie by himself. Now he could move heavy timbers with leverage and technique, understanding how to work with materials rather than against them. His hands, once soft and clumsy with tools, had developed the calluses and muscle memory that came from months of skilled manual labor. More importantly, Samuel's capacity for problem-solving had expanded in ways that amazed him when he stopped to consider the progression. Early in his stay, a collapsed wall had seemed like an insurmountable disaster. Now he approached complex challenges with calm confidence, breaking large problems into manageable components and working through solutions methodically. Samuel began using his handmade ruler to mark significant milestones on a growth chart he carved into the cabin's main support post. But instead of measuring his physical height, he marked achievements that represented his developing capabilities. The day he completed the roof, the first successful fire he built in a rainstorm, the moment when he realized he was no longer afraid of being alone in the wilderness. Each mark on the post represented a moment when Samuel had discovered new strength or capability within himself. The spacing between marks showed how his rate of growth had accelerated as challenges increased and his confidence developed. What had seemed impossible at the beginning of his journey now felt like natural extensions of skills he had always possessed but never known how to access. The measuring process also helped Samuel understand the difference between external validation and internal development. In his previous life, growth had been measured by grades, test scores, and approval from adults who evaluated his progress according to standardized metrics. In the wilderness, Samuel had learned to measure himself against his own previous capabilities and the real-world demands of survival and construction. Using his ruler to plan new projects, Samuel realized that precision in measurement reflected precision in thinking. The careful attention required to mark accurate measurements had trained his mind to approach all problems with similar methodical care. Planning a cabinet required the same systematic thinking as planning a roof, repair or organizing his winter food. Supplies, Samuel's growth chart on the cabin post, became a source of inspiration during difficult moments. When faced with a new challenge that seemed beyond his abilities, he could look at the progression of marks and remember that every previous achievement had once seemed impossible. The ruler had become a tool for measuring not just wood and metal, but courage and determination. On quiet evenings, Samuel would hold his handmade ruler and reflect on the strange journey that had brought him to this place of competence and self-reliance. The precisely carved notches represented more than measurement increments. They were symbols of the careful attention and patient work that transformed raw potential into practical capability. The ruler lay beside Samuel's other treasured tools, a reminder that true measurement came not from comparing oneself to others, but from tracking one's own progress toward goals that mattered. In the mountains, Samuel had learned to measure what was truly important, the growth of character, skill, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing he could build whatever life he chose to create. The chisel Samuel used to carve his builder's mark into the main beam of his cabin had been forged from the same railroad spike that had provided metal for his garden hoe. He had shaped it specifically for this purpose, creating a tool that was both functional and ceremonial, designed to leave a permanent record of his contribution to the cabin's continuing story. The decision to add his mark to the structure had not come easily. For weeks, Samuel had wrestled with questions of appropriateness and legacy. The cabin was fundamentally James Morrison's creation, built from Morrison's vision and sweat. Samuel had restored and improved it, but did that give him the right to claim permanent recognition alongside the original builder? The answer came to him while reading Morrison's journal on a quiet spring evening. In an entry dated September 1943, Morrison had written, "A building is never really finished, just passed from one caretaker to the next. Someday, another man will work on these walls, and I hope he'll understand that he's not just maintaining a structure, but continuing a conversation between builders across time." Morrison had intended for others to add their contributions to his work. The cabin was designed to grow and evolve, to serve the needs of whoever cared enough to maintain and improve it. Samuel's restoration was not a violation of Morrison's legacy, but a fulfillment of his hopes for the structure's future. Samuel chose to place his mark on the main support beam that ran along the cabin's ridgeline, the timber that bore the greatest structural load and would be the last component to require replacement. He selected a spot where the wood was smooth and unblemished, close enough to Morrison's original carpenter's marks to show connection, but distinct enough to represent his own contribution. The mark Samuel designed for himself was simple but meaningful. A compass rose with 8 points, representing the guidance he had received from all directions during his wilderness journey. The symbol acknowledged his grandfather's teachings, Morrison's example, the wisdom of the forest animals, and the lessons learned from the land itself. At the center of the compass rose, Samuel carved his initials and the year of his restoration. The actual carving required 3 evenings of careful work. Samuel wanted the mark to be deep enough to last for decades, but not so deep as to weaken the structural beam. Each cut had to be precise, following the wood grain to prevent cracking and ensuring that the lines were clean and permanent. As he worked, Samuel found himself thinking about the nature of legacy and permanence. The physical marks he was carving would outlast his own presence in this place, carrying his story forward to whoever might discover the cabin in years or decades to come. But the real legacy was not in the carved symbols, but in the skills and values that had guided the work. Samuel had learned from his grandfather that true building was about more than creating structures. It was about developing the character and capabilities that made lasting construction possible. The cabin represented not just shelter but proof that determination, skill, and respect for materials could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Working by lamplight with the sharp chisel, Samuel carved more than just his initials into the beam. He was inscribing a record of transformation, marking the place where an abandoned child had become a capable young man. The mark would serve as inspiration for future builders who might face their own seemingly impossible challenges. On the final evening of carving, Samuel added one more element to his builder's mark, a small date palm tree. The symbol his grandfather had taught him represented growth and resilience in harsh conditions. The palm tree would remind anyone who found the mark that Samuel had not just restored a building, but had grown into something stronger through the process. When the carving was complete, Samuel stood back and examined his work alongside Morrison's original marks. The 2 sets of symbols complemented each other, telling the story of a building that had been loved by multiple generations of builders. Morrison's marks spoke of hope and determination in the face of post-war trauma. Samuel's marks spoke of resilience and growth in the face of abandonment and isolation. Samuel understood that he had become part of something larger than his individual story. The cabin now carried the dreams and efforts of two builders, each contributing their unique skills and perspectives to the structure's evolution. Future builders would add their own marks, continuing the conversation between craftsmen across time. The carved symbols glowed in the lamplight, fresh cuts in seasoned wood that would darken and weather until they became indistinguishable from the original construction. Samuel's mark would age into permanence, becoming part of the cabin's fundamental identity rather than a superficial addition. Putting away his carving tools, Samuel felt the satisfaction that came from completing something that would outlast his own lifetime. His builder's mark was more than decoration or ego. It was a promise to future generations that someone had cared enough to build well, and the invitation for others to continue the tradition of craftsmanship and dedication that made permanent beauty possible. The GPS device lay on Samuel's workbench like an artifact from another civilization, its black plastic case and digital screen foreign among the hand-carved tools and natural materials that filled his workshop. The hiking family that had visited the previous week had left it behind accidentally, and when they returned to retrieve it, they found Samuel examining the device with the same careful attention he might give to an unusual piece of wood or an unfamiliar plant. "Keep it," the father had said when Samuel offered to return the GPS unit. "A boy living alone out here should have some way to navigate if he gets lost." The man meant well, but Samuel could see in his eyes the assumption that wilderness living was inherently dangerous and unpredictable, requiring technological backup for safety. Samuel thanked the family politely, but made no promises about using the device. After they left, he spent an evening exploring its functions, marveling at the tiny screen that could display his exact location anywhere on Earth. The technology was impressive, representing decades of scientific advancement and engineering sophistication. But it also represented something that troubled Samuel in ways he was only beginning to understand. The GPS unit worked by connecting to satellites orbiting high above the Earth, part of a vast technological network that made location finding automatic and effortless. Samuel could press a few buttons and know precisely where he stood, what direction he was facing, and how to navigate to any destination programmed into its memory. The device eliminated the need for map reading, compass work, or the careful attention to natural landmarks that had guided human navigation for thousands of years. Samuel set the GPS beside his grandfather's brass compass, studying the contrast between old and new approaches to finding one's way in the world. The compass was simple, reliable, and completely independent of any external systems. It pointed north because of fundamental magnetic forces that had operated since the Earth's formation. The GPS required satellites, computer networks, and electrical power, all of which could fail or be denied. More importantly, the compass required Samuel to think and observe, to develop skills that made him more capable and self-reliant. Using the GPS would make navigation easier, but it would also make Samuel more dependent on systems he did not understand and could not repair or maintain. Over the following days, Samuel found himself thinking about the broader implications of choosing between traditional skills and modern conveniences. The mountain wilderness had taught him that capability was more valuable than comfort, that understanding processes was more important than simply accessing results. The GPS could tell him where he was, but it could not teach him to read the forest signs that revealed weather patterns, animal behavior, or seasonal changes. Samuel had learned to navigate using methods that connected him directly to his environment. He read the position of the sun and stars, observed the flow of water and the growth patterns of trees, noticed how wind directions changed with elevation and time of day. These skills made him more aware of his surroundings, more attuned to the subtle signals that revealed the forest's moods and Rhythms. The choice between GPS and compass represented a larger question that Samuel had been wrestling with throughout his wilderness year. What did it mean to live authentically in a world increasingly dominated by technology that promised to make life easier, but might also make people less capable? Samuel had discovered that difficulty and challenge were not obstacles to be avoided, but opportunities for growth and learning. The hard work of rebuilding the cabin had developed his strength and skills. The isolation had taught him to rely on his own resources and judgment. The seasonal challenges had connected him to natural rhythms that modern life often ignored or suppressed. Using the GPS would not necessarily make Samuel's life better, just different. He would gain convenience, but lose the satisfaction that came from developing traditional skills. He would have easier access to precise location data, but less intimate knowledge of the landscape around his home. After a week of consideration, Samuel made his decision. He carefully packaged the GPS device and placed it in his supply cache, where it would be available if a genuine emergency required its use. But for daily navigation and exploration, he would continue relying on his compass, his growing knowledge of local landmarks, and the observation skills that connected him directly to the mountain environment. The choice felt right in ways that Samuel could not fully articulate. He was not rejecting technology out of stubbornness or fear, but choosing the tools and methods that served his deeper goals of self-reliance and environmental connection. The GPS was an impressive achievement of human ingenuity, but it was not the right tool for the life Samuel was building in the mountains. Standing on the ridge above his cabin with the brass compass in his hand, Samuel felt the satisfaction that came from knowing exactly where he was through his own observations and skills. The modern compass pointed north with the same reliability it had shown his grandfather, connecting Samuel to generations of navigators who had found their way through careful attention to the world. Around them, the welcome mat Samuel, braided from dried grass and wildflower stems, took shape slowly over the course of autumn evenings, each strand woven with the care and attention he had learned to bring to all his handwork. The materials came from the meadow behind his cabin, where he had spent the summer cultivating both vegetables and the wild plants that had volunteered to share his garden space. Samuel had never considered making a welcome mat until a comment from his most recent visitors, an elderly couple who had hiked up from the valley to see the legendary cabin built by a child. The woman had paused at his threshold and remarked, "Every proper home needs a welcome mat. It's the first thing that tells visitors they're approaching a place where hospitality matters." The observation struck Samuel as profound. Over the past year and a half, his focus had been entirely on survival, construction, and self-sufficiency. He had created a structure that could shelter him through mountain winters and provide everything he needed for independent living. But he had not consciously thought about creating a home in the deeper sense, a place that offered warmth and welcome to others. The braiding technique Samuel used for the mat was one he had developed through experimentation, combining methods he had learned for rope-making with patterns he observed in the basketry traditions described in his grandfather's old books. Each strand had to be selected for strength and flexibility, then woven into the growing pattern with tension that was firm, but not so tight as to make the mat stiff and uncomfortable underfoot. Working by firelight as the days grew shorter, Samuel found the repetitive motions of braiding meditative and soothing. His hands moved automatically through the familiar patterns, while his mind wandered through memories of the journey that had brought him to this place of peace and belonging. The abandoned boy who had stumbled upon the ruined cabin seemed like a different person, someone he remembered fondly but no longer was. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Samuel had arrived in the wilderness as someone defined by what others had done to him, abandoned by his parents, rejected by distant relatives, forced to survive on his own through no choice of his own. The cabin project had given him the opportunity to define himself by what he could accomplish rather than what he had suffered. Each strand of grass in the welcome mat represented a small victory in that process of self-definition. The meadow grass had grown strong and supple because Samuel had learned to work with the soil and seasonal rhythms that governed plant growth. The wildflowers had thrived because he had created an environment where both cultivated and wild plants could flourish together. The mat itself was beautiful because Samuel had developed the patience and skill necessary to create beauty from simple materials. As the mat neared completion, Samuel realized that he was no longer building just for himself. The cabin had become a destination for hikers and outdoor enthusiasts who had heard about his achievement and wanted to see what determination and skill could accomplish. Some came out of curiosity, others seeking inspiration for their own challenges, all left with stories about the young man who had proven that home was something you created rather than something you were given. The welcome mat would serve a practical purpose, protecting his clean floors from muddy boots and providing a comfortable place for visitors to sit while removing their hiking gear. But its deeper significance lay in what it represented: Samuel's recognition that true home meant more than personal shelter and comfort. It meant creating a place where others could find rest, encouragement, and examples of what was possible when someone refused to accept limitations imposed by circumstances. Samuel had learned that hospitality was not about having luxury to share, but about offering the best of what you had with genuine warmth and generosity. His cabin could provide visitors with clean water from his well, simple food from his garden, and the warmth of a fire built with his own hands. More importantly, it could offer them proof that human beings were capable of far more than they usually imagined. On the evening when Samuel placed the finished welcome mat outside his door, he stood back and looked at his cabin with fresh eyes. The structure was no longer just a rebuilt ruin or a survival shelter. It had become a beacon of hope and possibility, a demonstration that even the most challenging circumstances could be transformed through determination, skill, and faith in human potential. The braided mat lay ready to greet whoever might find their way to this remote mountain clearing. It represented Samuel's invitation to the world. Come, see what is possible, and leave knowing that you too carry within yourself the seeds of whatever home you choose to create. Inside the warm cabin, firelight danced across the photographs and artifacts that told the story of two builders who had found meaning and purpose in this place. Outside, the welcome mat waited under the stars, ready to greet the next chapter in the cabin's continuing story of shelter, growth, and the enduring human capacity to build dreams from determination and hope.